welcome everyone to the second of our lecture series on new directions in Hindu studies. We have a brilliant speaker lined up for today. And again, I apologize for the technical difficulties that we experienced in getting started. I would like to just very quickly introduce our speaker today. Shruti Patel is Assistant Professor of History at Salisbury University in Maryland, USA. She is currently an American Association of University Women, American Association of University Women, American Postdoctoral Research Leave Fellow, and a visiting scholar at Tufts University, completing her current book project entitled The Play of History. She received her PhD from the University of Washington and an MA from Columbia University. She works on the social and cultural history of South Asia, focusing on religious and social movements, princely states, the relationship between textual and physical culture, and knowledge formation during the early modern, colonial, and post-colonial periods, particularly in Gujarat, with relation to broader Indian Ocean networks. Her work has been supported by the Fulbright Hays Foundation, the American Institute for Indian Studies, University of Washington Simpson Center for the Humanities, and Foreign Language and Area Studies Fellowships. Her talk today is called Networks of Power. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Shruti.
Thank you so much, Arun. It's a pleasure to be part of this online platform with OCHS. Would be better in person, but this seems to be the case for many things in the past few years. I especially would like to thank Lucian Wang, Avni Chegg, and Arun, all three organizers of this online lecture series, New Directions in the Study of Modern Hinduism. And while I haven't had the pleasure of visiting OCHS in Europe, I have had the benefit of really enjoying earlier this year the larger series, the conference on rethinking Hinduism in colonial India. It's been really sort of fruitful for my thinking, and I think for many of us to which this online platform is related. So thank you for this really generous invitation for a book project that is still in progress at the moment. So I ask, how do we think about 19th century religiosity and power from new vantage points in South Asia? That is, how do we understand Hindu formations, identity, and character in a world of shifting political and non-political authorities, with the colonial state being just one of them? This question draws from my book project about the formation of the Swaminarayan Sampradaya, a Hindu devotional community, and the new forms of complex authority and subjectivity it advanced in the early 19th century in the region of Gujarat in Western India. In doing so, the historical study not only understands the Sampradaya's development in the context of the political economy, it critically thinks about the devotional in relation to the political prior to the era of nationalism. So today I'm turning to just one chapter, and within that, just a sort of a small excerpt from this chapter, which is more fully titled Networks of Power, the Sampradaya, East India Company, and Princely States. But today what I'd like to do is take some aspect here of these questions and walk us through the case of the Sampradaya's formation in the early colonial period. That is, looking at the late 18th through the early 19th century. So for today's talk, I will first discuss the geopolitical circumstances in Western India in which the new Hindu Sampradaya was initiated. And then I'll briefly pause to consider and reflect on my approach to this subject and what is at stake here. And then finally and centrally, I'll provide a glimpse of this complex process I'm speaking of that shaped the Sampradaya into a significant source of public influence by the third decade of the 19th century in Western India. That is, I will consider how the Sampradaya's proclivity for engaging power, political relations, ideas, and ethics allowed it to become influential in Western India. Taken together, these lines of analysis broaden the historical conversation beyond the colonial state as a site of power, broadly speaking, and outline a more capacious and complex character of modern Hinduism. Okay, and as this work is, again, in progress and not yet published, bear with me as I walk us through, sort of the variety of pieces here, and which you'll have to sort of, you haven't had the benefit of reading, but you will have to follow along in this talk. And I do hope that it is easily transparent what I'm trying to argue here. So along these lines, to appreciate how patterns of regional authority unfolded in the early 19th century, I want to step back and outline the dynamics of the late 18th century and all the factors that are at play for the Sampradaya's emergence. Okay. All right, so in this vein, first let's consider the sort of political configuration of Gujarat at this time. So in this era, Gujarat's local powers were organized by a configuration of small states headed by hereditary chiefs. So these are states, and this party of hereditary chiefs will be of importance to us later in the talk. But this configuration is of minor, major states, which then are renamed as princely states under European colonialism. Importantly, these states regularly experience upheaval, disarray, as their rulers remain embroiled in internal cycles of conquest and disputes with one another and with larger trans-regional powers. On that note, we see that various trans-regional powers reigned above these smaller forces and attempted to establish their larger empires in the region. So we have the Mughals in the earlier part of the 18th century, subsequently the Marathas, and then the English, all with lasting legacy. So, the polity ends and the influence ends. That's, simply not the case here. And the way they attempt to do this is with this constant negotiation with local hereditary chieftains who remain politically independent by making tribute payments to these overarching powers. Overall, by the end of the century, as historian Ghulam Nadri really finally sort of walks us through, significant warfare and concerns of raids, banditry, guerrilla warfare had marred the region, and the area was particularly distressed under the Marathas, whose relations with these hereditary chieftains had become quite economically extractive, militarily antagonistic, and certainly violent. In other words, what we have here is a unique sharing of sovereignty. So widely shared, in fact, it's more divided here than in any other part of India at this time. And this is a vital note for us here. And yet, Gujarat, it's very appealing. Long has a robust commercial economy, which is what is continuing to attract these imperial powers to seek regional authority, but it is tough to work here. So for instance, we see the English East India Company, which gains a foothold in Gujarat at the end of the 18th century, but we also see that it's unable to ascend to the same heights that it achieves in other parts of India, namely in Bengal and southeastern India. Why is this the case? Why is this the case that these trans-regional powers have such a difficult time over these decades in terms of acquiring regional authority? Again, there is constant negotiation that is required with these hereditary chieftains. Moreover, these parties face financial vulnerabilities. So for instance, the company relies on actually Gujarati merchants for their resources. So these relationships constantly need to be negotiated. Moreover, there is the issue of harsh geography, ranging from deserts, hinterlands. Obviously, you have the established port cities, but these areas in between are not easy to navigate. Finally, I would return back to the chieftains and note that these many local hereditary chieftains, whenever they would be removed from rule, would generate an incredibly difficult environment for any of these external parties to govern the region. In effect, by the end of the century, this region, long branded by what historian Ghulam Nadri has identified as a culture of resistance to political authoritarianism, becomes a site of power jockeying. So this regular combination of factors, highly shared sovereignty produces a region which she terms as having a non-dominant state, that is without any single political or economic authority. Thus, with no exclusive central or highly dominant state authority, new types of possibilities have potential here, I suggest. And that is, though, Gujarat still remains quite attractive. So we see in the early years of the 19th century, it presents a tremendous set of prospects for a range of forces. There is the growing ascendancy of the East India Company and other powers. However, we should keep in mind here in these early decades that vast territorial stretches of Gujarat are politically not associated with colonialism or the company, right? Which is to say that the East India Company's ascent is not linear, it's quite uneven. Company rules slowly, only iteratively, unevenly, extends its sovereignty, and this form and strength of this sovereignty across the region is quite uneven. So that is to say, for instance, we have a large number of Indian ruled princely states which are under the indirect rule of the company, existing along areas that are directly ruled by the company. This creates in the Bombay presidency, the larger area of which Gujarat is a part, it creates an exceptionally fragmented region over time, politically. What I suggest here is that this very fragmented, nebulous, contested, unsteady, complex political and economic environment affords a natural opportunity. Without any constant governing power in larger economic and social life, the region's development is impressionable to the influence of actors and processes on the ground. That is, the very fractured nature of authority here provides a natural avenue for new types of authority to gain more public influence. In this vein, I suggest that religious parties gain an avenue of public influence, that is the emerging Swaminarayan community here. Now here, just very, very briefly, I'll give a quick sketch of the Swaminarayan Sampradaya, which is the focus here of our case. This is a Hindu devotional community in the stream of Vaishnav thought, a particularly influential form of Hinduism in Western India and long-standing for multiple centuries at this time in this region. The Sampradaya is founded by the founder and teacher, or its guru, Sajanand Swami, also at the object of the community's devotion. Devotion or bhakti are at the center of this formation. Now we see in the 3 decades where Sajanand spends his, sort of tremendous energy in building this sampradaya, it does have a rapid rise. We see this accelerated rise and spread taking hold across all the major areas of greater Gujarat. So that means its sub-regions of Kutch, Kathiawar, northern and southern Gujarat. As I note in my larger work, it's really fascinating because he has this ability, he and his ascetics and early leadership, to really cross a variety of all these political boundaries and parties that I've just discussed by the end of these 3 decades. The movement grows quite popular, mainly with non-elite audiences, so pastoral, artisan, tribal groups, that is communities identified as Kodi, Bhil, Karnbi. And it's quite interesting because eventually, by the time we move into the 1830s, I would argue that the Sampradaya is able to create really strong, uniquely really strong regional networks. And it's interesting here to consider the East India Company in parallel at the same time, which is trying to establish a strong presence in areas of multiple competing overlapping authorities, parallel, but certainly for different motives than the Sampradaya. But it's quite interesting because, for instance, the company sees the same populations, Kodis and Bhils, it characterizes them as criminal, right? So these are sort of same population viewed and sort of related to really quite differently by these different parties that are coming to arise in the region. So as I asked there at the bottom, why? And so why I ask this is that while this outcome can certainly be attributed to charismatic leadership of Sajanand, a highly productive and mobile ascetic order, his ascetic order, none of these which I discuss here, and others have also discussed in their scholarship, philosophical shifts. While these factors exist, I suggest we think otherwise. We think more broadly. That is, understanding these factors as contained, insular, as the sole causes of community expansion, I think really misses and does sort of a disservice to the complexity of the Sampraday's development. This period and environment is one of tremendous change. It does not leave social identity, social mobility, collective values, religious cultures, political and economic fortunes. None of these remain untouched. And so it is just really difficult to think of the Sampradaya certainly coming about in any sort of a vacuum. So along these lines, we can now turn to the really excellent book-length study by Brian Hatcher, who I know has been a sort of continuous speaker and supporter of the work of OCHS and the series. And so Brian Hatcher argues here in his study of the Sampradaya and its role in the development of modern Hinduism, that we should reassess the Sampradaya as a religious polity. So that is seeing the community as an entity forged by itself and by others. And I quote here, situated along a scale of power relations and within a range of governing norms, right? That is, recognize the Sampradaya to function both as and among a range of local authorities or parties that we might consider to be inhabiting some form of power. I agree with this wholeheartedly, quite vigorously. And to this, though, I further ask, what is at stake in the idea of power when we view it historically? How do we get to power? What is this history of the formation's rise to stature, significant public influence, drawing many diverse audiences? In other words, what is the process of this creation of this Sampradaya, this form of power, this form of what Hatcher is terming as a religious polity, or what I also call or term non-statist authority in the region? For this, I would say it means closely attending to factors of the region, understanding the local dynamics as we've just been doing at the outset of this talk, so that we can more fully understand the character of the Sampradaya and what its reach and influence precisely meant. This means looking at the material realities of political, economic, social, and intellectual aspects. And what it also means is to look at sources from within the Sampradaya, let's say of devotion, hagiographical, philosophical texts, and to read them for not certainly their content for their philosophical, theological, aesthetic purposes, but also for larger historical purposes and motives in the creation of these materials and their content. Moreover, this requires considering other records outside the Sampradaya, but also within the Sampradaya that for one reason or another may have been overlooked. In other words, what I'm suggesting here is that certainly, it should be noted that with this cumulative approach, I certainly do not intend to diminish or negate the value of devotional sources to understand affect, ritual, philosophy, and other dimensions. I appreciate and turn to these excellent and necessary insights. But the examination I'm speaking of here in the same range of sources with the historical eye, however, is intended to consider new values that such an approach yields and the meaningful complexity it produces for our collective understanding. So now to turn back to the case at hand. Having looked at historically how the region of the 18th and 19th century and the factors that were really at play and that created both a ripe opportunity for the Sampraday's emergence, but also factors that it had to contend with, I now turn into the heart of this process of its formation. That is, this process of formation of Sajanand, I'm arguing here, is the Sampraday's creation in relation to others, as Hatcher has told us. This process, which is characterized by and as forming networks of power. Again, in my broader work, I discuss this more fully. That is the Sampradaya, the East India Company, and princely states. In other words, the Sampradaya posturing in relation to power, meaning internally creating its own character and habits and a reflection of power, authority, elite cultures, and externally forging the Sampradaya's place amongst the network of state and non-state authorities in the region. So again, this is really an expansive, complex, multi-dimensional process, which I certainly can't engage with fully here, but this is kind of the overarching picture that I'd like to be able to depict for you here. And so what I'm saying is that this process of networks the networks of power, this process of creation internally and externally rests on this fundamental incorporation of the political in the devotional, right? So this is what's driving this process. That is the internalization of political acumen in the devotional culture of the Sampradaya, okay? So functioning with political dexterity in the Sampradaya is part of a devotional act. In this sense here, what I'm pointing to is how Sajanand recognized that the state, the political state and other power holders in the region had to be engaged for material success. There was no choice at the level of the religious institution, as well as at the level of the individual. So that is his devotees. The new Sampradaya's regional success rested on making careful, thoughtful, skillful decisions in a heterogeneous, unstable environment. So this meant being pragmatic, adaptive, and responsive to regional dynamics. And Sajanand's willingness and intuition to engage different authorities and hierarchies and cultures, so whether it's the East India Company, the Marathas, elite princely states like Junagadh, or even the minor chiefs, hereditary chiefs, which we'll turn to shortly, this is all enormously, not simply effective, it is necessary. And we see this in the sort of ideology and other aspects of Sajanand's and his early leaders' discussions and behavior. So overall, there we go. So overall, like if we just sort of, if we step back here and we're considering this process of developing networks of power, and doing this on the basis of the sort of quality of political acumen, really seen as a devotional virtue, what we're seeing is essentially, this is something that is a relational process. So the Sampradaya's development as an authority is not, again, insular. Sajanand understood the interdependence and delicate nature of geopolitics. We see in a variety of examples his sensitivity to social, cultural, and economic interlinkings, the sort of finesse he possesses to work with diverse parties of different status, and the pragmatism he employs in the process. This is what allows him to it's not simply having diplomacy, it's the ability to pivot quickly as is necessary. What this means essentially is that he's able to maintain multiple networks and broker and draw on different sources of power, status and non-status. He's able to work with and attract highly dissimilar segments of the population, often that are not mutually friendly. And he has an ability to engage across these numerous powerful entities, which are established, but also those that are evolving and aspirational, right? All of this requires really fine social political discernment. And it also requires complex self-presentation by Sajanand and the Sampradaya. That is the ability to imitate, participate, and view oneself as part of these elite vocabularies and powerful practices. Again, this is quite a bit I've outlined here. And we can see then these energies must have been their, sort of a range of highly creative, but also high energy, laborious, constant network maintenance is constant work. And as we've seen in this landscape of Gujarat in our historical descriptions thus far, it's an ongoing job. So while in this presentation, we won't be able to look at all of these diverse efforts that I've implied and hinted at here, We'll turn to one or two key examples across these categories that help us understand the sort of use of political acumen and building relationships with power and configuring oneself as power. One of these examples then is the cultivation of relations with key socio-political factors. So that is, political acumen was the work of devotion through diplomacy, appealing and constant network building with regional power players and those that were vulnerable. So while Sajanand had cultivated devotional and a following of largely non-elite audiences, he also conceived a devotional and patronage relationship with key regional actors, that is the hereditary chieftains, one group of them, known as Kathi Darbars. This yielded fantastic gain. So this nascent Sampradaya formation found resonance amongst these Kathi Darbars, these rulers of minor petty states in Kathiawar, the peninsular region of Gujarat. They become foundational devotees. Now, some background here about them. They're originally from a pastoral nomadic background, and they've been settled in small peripheral chiefdoms outside the major states of Kathiawar. So we may not think of them at sort of this necessarily at the same status as the audiences I mentioned earlier, but perhaps somewhere in the middle and aspirational. But what we see with this party is that they face frequent political, economic, and social threats locally and from trans-regional powers. In other words, they're mired in a pattern of fighting, defending against each other's and these larger powers. Over time, this very same group earns them the classification of criminal caste, the label of outlaws by early British administrators. They are in a precarious position. That is, they're seeking upward mobility to surpass their limited cultural, political, and economic ranking in Kathiawar. And the way they attempt to do this is to equate themselves with the dominant culture and higher caste status culture of Rajputs. So a warrior ethos, martial tradition. And they do this by partaking in related elite cultural conventions. At the same time, however, they really are in a precarious position, as I've just described. So while they harbor a martial reputation and varying levels of local power, their status on the ground is precarious, stemming from years of political aggravation with the expansion of larger states and this sort of fluid, maybe even liminal state of caste identity here. In other words, this is a group at this time which is both vulnerable, dispirited, and aspirational. And as you can see here, I've noted the term Darbar, so they, their self-identification as Kathi Darbars, and Darbar is a term that many of you many South Asian audiences are familiar with, but here it's synonymous for Kathi Darbars with control, authority, and power. Semantically, the term references this on multiple levels. So you see this relationship and desire with power. So let's look at that group and how is it that they form this relationship with the Sampradaya. And so here, what I'm pointing to is Sajanand and early ascetics were sympathetic to the interconnections of social norms, status, inclusivity, as they exercise also social discernment and prioritize pragmatic decisions. It's this collective model then that allows the Sampradaya's fruitful existence. Along these lines, we see evidence by a close affiliation with the vibrant, ambitious Kathi Darbars and the judgment that's even used to exercise this community outside of these minor courts of Kathiawar. In other words, this is a two-way process. In this context, we see that Sajanand cultivates an approving association of this ambiguous group rather than its dismissal as outlaws, criminals, violent. And he helps win the affection and allegiance of Kathi Darbars towards their Sampradaya. In other words, his affirmative relationship with this ambitious, far-reaching, and power-imbued identity of a vulnerable group, I suggest, rather than their rejection, wins their deep affection and patronage for building the Sampradaya. And simultaneously, I suggest, harboring desires for higher social status alongside more sure political footing in the region, Kathi Darbars affiliate with the new Vaishnav Sampradaya, traditional traditionally they are affiliated with various Kur Devis and goddess traditions, so not Vaishnav Sampradayas. Evidently here, and in the process, excuse me, by affiliating this way, they provide, the Sampradaya and Sajanand provide this frustrated group with important public recognition and critically, regularize their social claims to being Rajput. So evidently here we see two processes are underway in the region: the creation of this novel cultural religious formation and a path of socio-political integration, both turning to each other in the shifting terrain of Western India during the 19th century, both with a common desire for public recognition and broader stability. So what we see here then in return is that the Kathi Darbars, for instance, provide key material resources to Sajanand for building the Sampradaya. As I noted, they become key patrons. We have an image here of the estate of the chief Kathi Darbar, Dada Khachar. This becomes the base in Kathiawad from where the Sampradaya's really important activities are organized, a base from where Sajanand resides, many ascetics reside, and from where they launch many of their activities. Patronage here is in the form of the Kathi Darbar is providing for ascetics who reside here, housing, food, clothing. These ascetics reside here and they built the creative infrastructure of the Sampradaya. They're educated here, they produce literature here, festivals are organized from here. And also we see this continues. It is Khachar's family then that actually ends up providing significant land, money, cattle to not simply support this base, but to support Sajanand's family, which will then eventually by the third decade of the 19th century become leaders of the Sampradaya, right? And so again, we are seeing this kind of mutual exchange. And I would say that the implications of these early acts cannot be underestimated for later developments of the Sampradaya across the region. This joint process of regional patronage and affirmation. We see that many private estates like that of the Khachars actually come to signify the property of the Sampradaya and its hereditary leadership in Western India. And again, we see this as a reciprocal relationship. Certainly Sajanand is the teacher, but their teacher, but for instance, he is significantly engaged in their social and political and economic affairs. For instance, he is key in petitioning on behalf of these groups in front of the larger kingdom of Bhavnagar. He intervenes in internal Kathi disputes about territory. In other words, he's watching out compassionately for their political and economic fortunes. But this would not have been lost upon Sajanand or early leadership, that this has ripple effects. In other words, these are the resources of the Sampradaya, right? Another sort of quick example I'll turn to in this process here is thinking about martial tradition, which I just referenced, and Kathi Darbars sort of desire to be associated at a higher social status, and doing this by associating themselves with, by making Rajput claims, that is of a warrior ethos. Now, while this identity may be part of their sort of historical mythic self-formation, martial activity and culture is truly part of their 19th century reality. They are mercenaries. They are involved, as I noted, in extensive internal conflicts, defending their properties. In other words, this is a significant part of their identity. And so what I suggest is that Sajanand affirms this culture of Kathis, of their warrior ethos. I can't sort of get into all the examples here, but he does that. But he does this despite his teachings in the Sampradaya to lessen caste distinctions and to emphasize these identities that make them different. In other words, as scholars have argued that Kathi Darbars were likely attracted to this Sampradaya in the 19th century because of the non-violent ethos Sajanand offered them, I actually argue the reverse, that it's his appreciation of this martial identity rather than its denial that affirms and attracts this disenfranchised aspirational group. That is that Sajanand realizes you cannot estrange people coming from very different backgrounds and occupations and traditions in this region who are potential allies and devotees. And so we see then the early Sampradaya, he's offering this really robust accommodative position, which allows people as allies, well-wishers, or close adherents to hold on to their pre-existing identities and lifestyles as they join the community. And so there's sort of numerous examples along these lines, but what I will do now is sort of briefly turn to another aspect where we can see this type of internalization of the sort of savviness and political acumen and activity at work here in considering the forging of regional power. And here I would argue, oh, excuse me, actually, before I do turn to that, I simply wanted to add here again and reinforce that what we see is, again, Sampradaya is certainly not insulated from dynamics in the region. And it's not simply just aware of them. It actually hinges on working with and through them. This is what political acumen is. And I also want to note then, we have to think of these relationships, as really resisting a singular sort of easy reading. That is, these are complex relationships that are certainly built on profound adoration between Kathi Darbars and Sajanan, loyalty, even ideas of kinship and respect. And they're also driven by opportunity, benefit, vulnerability, aspiration, competition, all of these factors. In other words, they should not be read as mutually exclusive in a devotional environment. So now this other example, second example I will turn to, is that while the Sampradaya upheld political acumen as part of institutional building, I'd also like to, to create the community, I'd like to also point to how it continued this practice, not just by the leadership, but by individuals through followers, who by upholding this value could in turn empower the institution. So at first glance, this type of outlook and activity seems pretty restrained. When we look at the Vachanamrut, which is a canonical text of Sajanan's teachings, well, we find references here where Sajanan asserts to his followers that he has a real sort of apathy, disinterest, kind of really simply unmoved by governing forces. But I think this actually belies the degree to which the community historically, when we look at example after example, actually stays attuned to matters of power. We also find that Sajanan makes these comments, and regularly in other areas, he encourages his followers, his ascetics, to actually develop an attitude of detachment from one's ego and from the mundane world. But he says at the same time, they should engage in the world, in activity, in pravruti, on behalf of the Sampradaya. So reconciling this seemingly paradoxical view of asceticism and worldly immersion is really Sajanan's logic. The dedication to the Sampradaya's development and activity and sort of strengthening of oneself in the sense is in and of itself superior form of devotion to any passive detachment or asceticism. Worldly action should be transformed into devotional action. So this proposition of worldly engagement and devotion, I would say, is tremendously significant, because when the teaching applies to not simply ascetics who engage, for example, petition on behalf of the Sampradaya in front of kings or other local political power holders, we see when this teaching is applied to householder followers and their activities such as trade, governance, farming, service, care for one another in the community, it translates to really substantial material and social support that is eventually channeled towards the institution. In other words, the intertwined position of institution building and piety extend to sort of all spheres of life, including political. So engaging with governments, engaging with government relations. Again, cannot sort of fully launch into that example here. And we see that this political art is internalized as a form of devotional ethics. By the third century of the third decade of the 19th century, we see that perhaps this on-the-ground experience of Sajananda and ascetics and devotees has translated and been codified into ethical prescriptions. That is, the quality of political discernment is now crystallized into a requirement for devotion for his devotees. So we see that by 1826, in the compilation known as the Shikshapatri, which is essentially standardized norms of personal conduct, which are first disseminated in the region through letters and then later formalized into this text, has sort of explicit and implicit injunctions gesturing to developing and sort of fine-tuning this type of sensibility. So in more explicit terms, for example, we find these injunctions to prepare for social, economic, and political fluctuations through behavioral guidelines like Sajanan saying, when engaging rulers, caution and decorum are necessary. Arguments with the king should be avoided, as should friendship with any women associated with kings. Adherents are instructed, Sajjana instructs them to greet rulers and to always appreciate kings and teachers, gurus, with gifts. And political emergencies are especially recognized, and thoroughly so. Sajjana counsels that if one's life, property, reputation are at stake, without any hesitation, move away, even if this is one's natal village. So further, Sajjana is outlining guidelines to especially counsel rulers who are his devotees on their lifestyle and ethics. For instance, he tells this first generation of adherents, one should be equipped to know where to send spies. In other words, this is the designation of political sophistication as an inherent devotional virtue in the Sampradaya. And this appears to have been aimed at providing people with increased control, or at least some sense of it, in a region and a context of high variability. That is, studied engagement with regional powers was necessary, as states, as we know, states, financiers to which these peasants are vulnerable could be erratic and highly exploitative. So this is deemed as necessary, this sort of savviness. In other words, these injunctions are intended to invest people, they seem to be, with increased freedom by outlining various options that can give them more chances for self-possession than hopelessness. In other words, the Sampradaya spread, strength, and popularity is resting on efforts to maneuver this dizzying configuration of political, early colonial, princely states, in addition to numerous ecological, economic, and social challenges in the region at this time, which are also often linked back to statist forces. And so on that note here, as I'm pointing to this argument of how devotional space becomes native for this type of political thought and action unapologetically, and why should it apologize? I think that's the point in this construction here, is that it brings to light, as we're looking at this idea of networks of power, that this is certainly very complex and a term that just can't be used enough in this process. Affection isn't mutually exclusive with relationships of benefit. Devotion doesn't mean one is not strategic. The Sampradaya doesn't mean, a devotional Sampradaya, Hindu Sampradaya does not mean not a relationship with power or authority, right? And so here in this sense, we can see how a devotional movement shaped a broader mode of social and public life in this case. This religious initiative then might be understood as a provision of leadership, non-statist leadership, where there existed some gap in consistable, reliable governance and sort of public aspects of life. And so here, you know, we can see in this type of a case, it's pretty interesting to see how the Hindu community is also a source of public power. Again, does not have to be mutually exclusive with that. And the colonial state, for instance, here isn't sole power or an overpowering source of influence. In other words, this is not Bengal. This is not a sweeping colonialism. In fact, the EIC has trouble, and by 1830 turns to the Sampradaya for its networks and for coming in. And so on that note, I will pause here because I think there's quite a bit we can move into, and for the sake of time, apologies if I've sort of rushed through any of that, but I will leave it at that. And thank you so much for to all of you for listening and engaging. Thank you.